So in terms of just today, and it's really nice to have both the cyclists or you guys as athletes, parents and coaches in the same space, because it's always very rare to be able to get to translate the same message for all three groups at the same time. Usually I would talk to you guys first, and then you'd go home and then tell your parents, and then that would get scrambled a bit. Or I'd talk to coaches and they'd tell parents, and then that would come back down to you guys, and you wouldn't really understand that they were really talking about either. But in terms of nutrition, nutrition is probably one of the most overly evolving disciplines around sport, mostly because it has huge overflow into what people do in their normal day-to-day lives, because no matter what, you guys might cycle, but not everybody cycles. What is the one thing that every single person has to do, usually about 3 times a day, is eat food. So in terms of nutrition and sports nutrition, it does seem to be something that is just always rapidly changing and not necessarily always for the better, which is why the idea to have this type of workshop is to try and focus on what you guys actually need to focus on, rather than all the chit chat and a lot of the extra stuff that's going on, especially if you follow anything in the media and that type of stuff. So in terms of just knowing your cycling history, I think that cycling is one of the most amazing sports in terms of where a lot of our original endurance-based nutrition education or nutrition foundations actually came from. So being the Tour de France, eating spaghetti while you were cycling, it's very unlikely that you will ever see that happening again. And as a result, but even now in terms of whether it's picking up a bag on the way on a 250k stage, or whether it's just what we are actually being able to carry on the bike, it has changed quite progressively over the last few years. And it's quite important just to keep picking out what is actually still important, and whether the foundations or whether something's actually changed at all, whether anything we just think it's changed because it's changed shape or form or packaging. So in terms of nutrition, and this is the dichotomy that is probably, again, not, you guys don't have to worry about it as much as maybe coaches and parents, is that nutrition is relatively easy and incredibly difficult at the same time. So it is very normal for you guys not to really need to worry about too many details, but to get those details right consistently actually does take a lot of effort and a lot of practice. And I'm sure as adults, most of you will know, if you've ever been on a diet, anything that has a structured framework, how difficult it is to stick to something and to make it consistent and to keep doing it over and over again. And that's where this relationship comes to, why is it so easy just to eat food, but why is it so difficult to get it right all the time? And the same idea that a lot of the time, and this came a lot through over the last few years, this idea of looking for the 1% in sports performance. And the 1% that could be maybe a supplement or changing a nutrition strategy, or for some people a pillow or a mattress. But in terms of actually, what about the other 99%? And so in terms of where you guys are at, I'm not worried about the 1% yet. I'm definitely still worried about the 99%. And in terms of that is also to help parents and coaches to understand we don't get to worry about that until much later. And in terms of now, that's why it's very simple but also very difficult. So just to help understand, you do happen to be going into a sport or progressing in a sport, that the one nice thing is you do get to eat lots of food. So if we looked at one way of presenting the amount of energy that a cyclist would require to do one stage of the Tour de France, can any of you actually think you could eat that many bananas? Would you ever want to eat that many bananas in one day? How about if I presented it slightly differently and said, that's the same amount of energy but in cheeseburgers? Now, does that change? Would any of you prefer to try and attempt it just by eating cheeseburgers? So this is that same idea again, is these polar opposites where one would be considered this very sort of healthy, nice, neat and clean version of energy, and the other one would be considered something where we're a bit concerned because we're not really sure if that's a healthy way of doing something, but at the same time they're the same amount of energy in both of those pictures. And so this is that same principle, and while I'll end up sounding a bit like a broken record, is that it is easy and incredibly difficult. So the nutrition is always the sum of its parts, and you guys have been checking out what technical things on your bicycle, you know all the names of all the different parts. So nutrition is a little bit like that as well, is that you need some wheels, you need a frame, but you also need the teeny tiny things that go with it. So I prefer the idea of a cupcake with sprinkles, but you guys might prefer the idea of bicycles with lots of technical things. I don't know all the names, and I don't profess to know all the names of all the technical things. So instead, and a lot of the time when people talk about nutrition, they always want to re-emphasize what you should know by now or what you should know later as you carry on cycling. And funny enough, this is one of my biggest moves, is actually to say I don't really care if you know anything about food. What I want you to do is I want you to do it. So habits is what the foundation is, not the knowledge that you feel like you need to go and read up about what food contains more sugar or which food has more fat or whatever it is that you might find, unless obviously you're quite interested in nutrition, because that's different. But if you look at this, you can see that knowledge is only one part of making sure that you're a successful eating athlete. In reality, knowledge I don't know if any of you ever thought, you might know that smoking's bad for you, but how many people still do it? So in terms of this is the complete opposite in terms of nutrition behaviors. But how many of us know what we would like to do for eating, but we don't actually often put it into place? So the adults understand, and you guys will understand more as you grow up. So in terms of this, that's why I don't really want you to focus too much on the knowledge. I think that the habits are the most important. And so again, then the question comes, which habits are actually important? Which ones do you guys need to think about and to try and evaluate as you go forth in your cycling progression? And so one of the things in terms of athletic development is sometimes quite nice to present it a bit like from here you're just going to have this lovely linear line into the future. And in reality, we also know that that's quite unlikely, and then we generally are going to always have ups and downs, and it's going to look a bit more squiggly rather than straight. But as I reiterate, in terms of which actual habits are important, but as you guys are getting to that age, one of the other parts of that is, well, who's responsible for those habits? So I know it sounds terribly horrible when I say, well, for once, in this instance, your parents are now going to start making you guys work for it. So parents, in terms of cultivating those skills and habits, is that if we take care of everyone until they're 20, which I'm sure you're not really wanting to do anyway, but if you don't start taking responsibility for some of those habits, you guys are never going to get any better at it. So while you can't drive yet, so you can't get yourself to training, and you can't buy food because you don't earn any money yet, you can pack it and you can try and think about it when you go to the shops to try and make it so that it's there for you. So the idea is to try and look at, well, how much responsibility should we be taking over time? And that doesn't mean I need you guys to cook 3-course meals at home for your parents. It just means you need to start thinking about how you can take more responsibility for your eating around your cycling. So just specifically that component. And it's nice to have the parents so that you guys can hear that as well, is that it's nice to be able to take care of your kids and feed them nicely, but it also doesn't necessarily help them when they have to leave the house and they don't know how to do anything for themselves. So it's more of a life lesson necessarily than just nutrition, but it really does play a role in what happens later in terms of nutritional skills. So the basics, what do we need to focus on in terms of the skills that you guys need to try and get better at? So some of you're all still growing. So the key, you need to eat often and eat everything in terms of eat all the different types of foods. And I'm sure you've heard that before, but that is the simplest way of putting the message. But now the skills that you might need to do to work within that. So how many of you eat breakfast every morning? It's usually the majority, which is decent. Do you all eat lunch every day? Yeah. And supper? Okay, so if we all eat 3 meals a day, that's a great start. How many of you ever find, though, that when you get quite busy, you skip meals? Okay, so we've got a few there at the back. Adults also, particularly, sometimes this will happen. So it is quite important that if you start thinking, well, how do you eat often? So obviously, eating 3 times a day should probably be the bare minimum. Eating more often than that is great if you can fit it in. So some of you will have breaks at school or you'll eat after school. But it is quite important just try not to skip meals. So that means, and if you're ever decided that you need to go somewhere but you haven't eaten yet, how many of you feel confident to actually ask a coach or a teacher, do you mind if I take 5 minutes just to eat my food, rather than not eating your food, because it's usually not encouraged in those, like in class or... So have you guys ever had that before, where you've had to ask, can I eat my food please? And are people usually quite good about saying, yeah, that's fine? So, not always. So sometimes it's quite important to figure out how to ask and who to ask, can I please eat my lunch? sounds like a really ridiculous thing, but believe it or not, it's still a skill that you need to learn. So not skipping meals and planning your snacks ahead of time. How many of you have then finished a training session and then you haven't had anything to eat afterwards and you don't know when you're going to eat something, so you ask your parents nicely to stop somewhere on the way home? One honest individual, maybe 2 or 3. And parents, how difficult is it when you know that they haven't eaten and they probably need to eat and we haven't organized something, so we do stop on the way home? Perfectly normal and understandable. So sometimes to get around the idea of how to enhance that and get better at that skill, have you guys ever tried writing a snack list for a week? So if you know that you've got training on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, have you ever tried writing out your 3 snacks for the week and then adding them to the shopping list? So that's something, does that sound easy? Does that sound hard?
Very easy.
Very easy, thank you. So in terms of, it's not that difficult because one, you know what you like eating after training, and I'm pretty sure you can all write. As far as I know, you have a high literacy rate in this country. So it's very important that if you guys start doing stuff like that, you get better at it, you get better at which snacks you like, you get better at putting them there on the shopping list, and magic, they appear when you need them the most. So something like that is a very important skill that you can work with your parents at getting better at. In terms of improving cooking, what is the quickest, easiest things that you guys can make at home at the moment in terms of a snack? So what was that? Pasta? Toast? Okay, so we're on the pasta toast level. Cool? Can do pasta and toast. Anyone can make scrambled eggs?
No.
Okay, so there's some yes and no's. We'll see. How about poached eggs? Can anyone make poached eggs yet? Okay, we've got some brave souls. Cool. So guys, one of the things about being able to get home is if someone else is busy, i.e. your parents, and you're alone in the kitchen, you probably need to figure out the fact that you can't only make pasta. So pasta is great, but if we go back to what the first sort of idea was, is that eating often, but eating lots of different types of foods means you can't only have a cooking repertoire of one snack. And I'm sure that that's not really true because you guys do know how to make things like wraps or rice cakes and peanut butter or things that are easy to put together. But you don't always think about it because you don't often practice making different snacks. So again, the idea of trying to enhance your cooking skills is to try and practice. So if you can make scrambled eggs, next time maybe try to make poached eggs or an omelet. If you make pasta, maybe next time try to make lasagna. Okay, lasagna is a little complicated, I will admit, but for a snack. But there's this idea that progressing, and so parents, I think the nice thing there is to try and figure out, well, what would you think is the next level of cooking up on egg on toast? What would you progress it to? Yes? So, and that's why food is amazing, because there is so many options for food. If I could ever think that one of the reasons I ended up in nutrition is because there's just so much variety that you can really never get bored. If you're getting bored, you're doing it wrong. So we have to keep thinking, like, how do you make it better and better? And so whether it's starting your own recipe book at home with easy snack options that we find on the internet and we print out and you practice, or whether it's just asking mom and dad to help you make something you've never made before so you can add it to your list. These are things where all of a sudden you get to take responsibility, you get better at something, and now the kitchen is no longer a scary place where you're going to burn everything and your mother's very scared if you go in there. So it is very important, and you want to try new things so that that list gets longer and longer. So there's never a limitation that all of a sudden you're at cycling camp and the kitchen has run out of food and now you're left to feed the entire team and you know what you can put together in the kitchen. So think of it a bit like a challenge like that. So as I say, building on that obviously is why do we need to snack? And the snacks often is that around your training becomes the part where as an athlete you start to differentiate from somebody who doesn't train. So this is where things get a little bit more technical. And it is just expanding on what you would normally do, but just doing it more and more often. So writing a list for your snacks, trying new options. How many of you have ever finished this training session and actually don't feel hungry? Okay, so changes in appetite is a very difficult thing to get around if you're not thinking ahead. So Do you guys feel like eating baked beans on toast when you don't have an appetite? I was thinking of something complicated, that's all I had. So what would we rather have? Baked beans on toast or a smoothie when we don't have a good appetite? Okay, so a smoothie, for logical reasons, you guys can understand why it's much easier to take it in when you're not feeling that hungry. But you know that you probably should have an extra snack because you just trained for an hour and 15 minutes and you feel really tired and your coach yelled at you, and that's fine. But now I know I need a snack and I don't feel like food. So you need to be able to modify what traditionally is already in your cooking repertoire for things when you're not feeling so hungry. So a lot of the time you need to start thinking ahead of what does that look like and do I know how to make it? So how many of you have ever attempted a smoothie in the blender at home? Okay, so it's fun to play around with without obviously taking your fingers off. But it is an important skill where you start playing around with the combinations, because what happens if you put in too much banana? Or if the banana is not quite ripe yet? Okay, and it starts to get quite like stringy and bitter. Or if you put in too much cocoa powder. Ugh, that one's like that horrible cocoa taste when it doesn't taste as chocolatey as you thought it would. So those are things you have to try out and the things you have to practice. In terms of nutrient-rich foods, the reason for this is just to remind you guys that as much as, and I will allude to this as well, do you think that it's bad for cyclists to eat or to drink Coke? No. Okay. So no, but when would a cyclist drink Coke? Okay, so you've got after, you've got maybe during, but these are things that you will hear lots of, and the idea is that how often should we be having foods that are less nutrient dense? So how often do we get to have Coke after training? Okay, so would it be all the time? No. Probably not. So the reason I just say for nutrient-rich foods is that most of the time it's better to choose foods that give you more than one nutrient, and then sometimes it's good to have things that are just taste nice. And you guys can choose how you want to distribute that. But it is just to try and encourage the overall sense that you already know that we should generally choose foods that are healthier. So in terms of your training strategy, most of you probably don't need too much during at this point because your sessions are how long? Hour and a half maybe? Sometimes? So in most cases, you don't have to focus too much on what you're going to have during, but the befores and afters are quite important. And I talk about food combinations because, in essence, is there any rule about what you can and can't have before and after? Have you heard anything, or has anyone ever told you you must eat this before and eat this after?
You probably get told to eat more carbohydrate-rich food at the beginning, before, and then maybe after you might go carbohydrate, protein.
Cool. So, funny enough, that's a perfect nutritional way of describing it. But obviously, the inference is to try and say, well, if you eat food, a lot of the times, if you put them in combinations, they'll take care of that without worrying about it. So what do you guys like eating before you cycle? Say that again? Nothing? Okay. Guys, believe it or not, it's a lot more fun if you just shout loudly at me. Porridge. So porridge with milk, fruit with yogurt, toast, egg with toast, pasta. These are all lovely food pasta on its own or pasta with something? Pasta with cheese, pasta with chicken, spaghetti bolognese. They're all food combinations that you guys have already. And they generally take care of whatever it is that you need to worry about. So Nando's, side note, does everyone know that Nando's is actually South African? This is my very proud face. So Nando's is Portuguese-style chicken from South Africa. Anyway, just so that you all know that next time you go in there, just say thank you, South Africa, for the great Nando's that you have brought me. So in terms of food combinations, it's really important that again, focus on thinking about how to put it into food. So every time you think about what should I have before and what should I have after, just think of your favorite things and put them together. Okay, except maybe for some odd combinations, but we can always talk about that later. And so maybe this leads on to what I kind of asked you guys already. So we often, whether it's as adults or even as you guys, the things that you'll hear and the things that people will tell you about food will generally come back to, oh, that's good for you or it's bad for you. Now, I've got two options here. So the one is the idea of what a healthy diet looks like on a plate. And the other is Michael Phelps' diet before he went to Beijing in 2008, which is quite a while ago, and it was his second Olympics, as far as I remember. But if you read Michael Phelps' diet, does that look like a healthy diet? Does it look like a tasty diet? Does it look like a diet for an athlete who's training about 5 or 6 hours a day? Oh, he also happens to be he was over 2 meters, and he's a rather big individual. So what I think is quite important is just to remember that there is a differentiation that when we eat for health, that looks one way, and when we start eating for performance, it gradually shifts, that there's a little bit of a gray zone outside of that, where things that might not always be considered healthy become applicable for athletes. And as again, I don't necessarily think that you guys should be having Coke after every training session or eating cupcakes beforehand because it tastes good, and I said you can have combinations of food, and a cupcake is a combination. But it is quite important just to remember that there is a distinction between the two, where there is room for performance-based eating that is not otherwise considered healthy. And so if anyone ever tells you, oh, you can't have that, it's bad for you, is to kind of go back, okay, is it bad for my health, or is it bad for me as a performing athlete? And sometimes you'll get to have athlete-based food rather than healthy food. But that's how you need to frame it, because KFC might be, actually no, KFC doesn't fit into either of those groups, sorry. So it's quite important that you can tell the difference between which one is which and which one actually makes sense for you as an athlete around training, even if it tastes nice. And so then the next habit that you need to get into practicing is that whatever you do in training needs to infer whatever you eventually do around your racing and your competition. So a lot of new athletes, or athletes as they develop, will train a certain way, and then all of a sudden they'll get to a race and they'll do everything completely differently. Do you guys think that that makes a lot of sense? So if you never eat during training and you only drink water, and then you suddenly go to a race and decide to have 2 Lucozades, a Coke, and a bagel, do you think that that's going to be nice for your stomach? No. Okay. So the concept is that if you want to train your body to be able to race, you have to train your tummy to do it too. So the habit is that you must practice what you do around training in a way to make sure that it's the same for racing. And that's why I say that it's really important to keep a routine. So the same way that you'd warm up or warm down on a bicycle, the same way that you'd have some foods before, or the timing that you start sequencing. So, but it's a habit that you get into, and whether the food is the perfect food for you yet is not that important. It's more that you get into the habit of having a routine for your eating around your racing. So when's our next big race? Don't say tomorrow. Next year. Okay, so we've got lots of time to practice. But please just try to think, and coaches, this is also quite important to just make sure that if you think that there will be a racing strategy from a nutrition perspective, to make sure that it does happen at some point during training, and that it's not a surprise, or that we're not trying anything new. So guys, that it generally means whatever fluid, if you decide that you want to drink fruit juice during a race, you're not going to try that for the first time on that race. You do need to try it beforehand. So just try to think about that, because it also just means that you need to think about it in advance, and it's not something that just happens on race day. And so, as I said, packing it ahead of time means the same thing. If you know that you've got 2 or 3 key sessions that are going to be almost a bit like racing, then you want to practice your food the same way that you're practicing your racing. And so then the last one is just me doing due diligence as a dietitian, is that do we think that athletes and everybody else in the normal sphere of humans eats enough vegetables? Probably not. How many of you currently eat Brussels sprouts? Okay, that's better than normal. How many of you have vegetables at most of your meals? Okay, I'm feeling like there's a parental influence there, which is quite good. So, but it's really important, guys, that the idea is that when you're training, those foods are there to give you energy and to repair your body and to taste good when you don't have a good appetite. It's never going to be the time that you eat Brussels sprouts, unfortunately for Brussels sprouts. But when you're at all your other meals or at any other time that you're at home, those are the times that you then have to make up for what you don't have around training. So your vegetable intake is really going to help make sure that your immune system stays nice and strong and never really needs to, because if you get sick, then you lose out on training. And if that happens repeatedly, at some point it's going to impact on your progression as an athlete as well. So we just want to always make sure that for growing, for repair and recovery, and for your immune function, don't forget about the vegetables. However, they don't have to taste terrible. So if they taste terrible, what's your least favorite vegetable? Sprouts. Spinach? Broccoli maybe sometimes. If you don't like a vegetable because it doesn't taste nice, we have to find a way to cook it so it will taste nice. So there is your second or third cooking challenge that I've already given you. Is if you don't like a certain vegetable, your challenge is now to find a way to make sure it tastes nice. I am not going to give you too many ideas because it's going to end up sounding like deep fried goodness with bacon. So that is not going to be the way that I would suggest you start. But it is really important that you guys think about how to make sure you can eat all the vegetables. And that they also are things that you don't spit out while your parents aren't looking. And in terms of the fresh, tinned, and frozen, it doesn't really matter if you're trying to extend or increase your vegetable intake. It doesn't really matter what form it comes in when you start. And this is, so I find this, it's like the influence of social media is quite interesting in terms of food. So how many of you ever saw Lionel Messi in the Lay's adverts when he was eating Lay's chips? Did that make any of you go out and buy Lay's chips? Probably not. So it's one of those weird ones where you think, well, as a role model and as people who are athletic role models, how does their eating affect us as growing athletes? So Barcelona have recently come up with a slightly different tact, and they've actually started it's a whole football club, I guess, where they've started another version of, or a different version called Eat Like a Pro. And the advert, funny enough, is a little boy who decides he doesn't like broccoli, and the whole of Barcelona football club arrive in his kitchen and cook him supper, and then he decides he likes his broccoli. It's not as 100% as I think it's going to go if some of you are trying new vegetables, but it is at least a move in the right direction away from Lionel Messi eating Lay's. But does that mean that if your favorite cyclist says that he eats chicken McNuggets, does that mean that that is going to make you a better cyclist? Not necessarily. I don't know if any of you remember, but the other nutrition story that came out of the 2008 Olympics was when Usain Bolt said that he ate chicken McNuggets before he raced. And the whole of nutrition buried their heads and didn't really know what to do with themselves until he said that the reason he ate chicken McNuggets, is because he didn't know what Chinese food tasted like. I don't know 100% how true that is now, considering what the Olympic food hall looks like, but he did say that he was unsure about the other foods, so therefore he stuck to the foods he already knew. So I'm trying to make sure that you guys never get into a position that chicken McNuggets are the only food that you actually know, and you never have to use that as your performance outcome one day when you're racing. But in terms of that type of stuff, you will progress in the details. So obviously I'm giving you a whole bunch of stuff to think about, and a lot of it comes down to which habits you're going to try and get better at. But you have to start at the beginning, and they will only get better over time. So I don't ever expect any of you to be perfect cycling eaters, not eating cyclists, just eating like a cyclist, in terms of how you progress, and just to try and make sure that it starts becoming part of the way that you think about your training and the way that you start incorporating and improving on your habits. And so in terms of the little finer details, so again, that 1% to me is like the sprinkling or the frosting on the cupcake. I don't need you to worry about the frosting yet. I need you to worry about baking the cupcake. So get the most of it right first, and then we can worry about the rest of the stuff later. And that there's a lot of trial and error in it. You need to try something before you can know whether or not it works. So hence the fact that even if your favorite cyclist says that they follow a certain plan or they eat a certain way, you need to figure that out for yourself to be able to know whether or not it's going to work. And that, unfortunately, no one will be able to tell you unless you try. And this is maybe more from a parental and a coach perspective rather than for you guys. But things like supplements at this point or specialized sports foods really are things that are like the sprinkling on the cupcake. And so it is really important that we focus primarily on getting the food basics right first before thinking or worrying about any of the teeny tiny things on the top. And that if anybody's cupboard looks like that at this point, please come and speak to me afterwards. We want to try and avoid, we want more fridges and less cupboards in that context. And it really is the fact that as you progress, if you worry about something or you think that you're missing out on something, the idea is to ask. So if you have access to a dietitian near you or you need to email a dietitian, is to ask if you think you need anything rather than just assuming that someone else said that you might, therefore you will. Supplementation is very much something that needs to be at the end of a nutrition journey, not at the beginning, because you need to get all the other stuff right first. And the marketing around this is very difficult. So you guys are going to get this left, right, and center, especially as soon as you're on any form of social media, depending on when you're allowed to do that, is that all of this is directed at selling stuff. It is not going to necessarily direct it at telling you whether or not you're going to be a better cyclist if you drink or eat it. But it is going to target that doubt in your mind that says, this is for you because you'll be better. And that's not necessarily the case. So unfortunately, I picked up the one on your left earlier this week, and I was mildly horrified because unfortunately the position stands, and again this is for coaches and parents, the position stands state that we really should not be encouraging any form of supplementation until an athlete is fully grown. Meanwhile, if you look at just the name and the brand name, it is directly targeted at that age group, which we have been asked really nicely to try and keep it away from as long as possible. So it's a very difficult one because I don't know if anyone will do anything about it, but it is borderline unethical considering what the evidence says around research and supplementation in athletes, especially when they're growing. Whereas the other two are more sort of extra credibility comes with sponsorship. And I want you guys to remember that just because Team Sky uses it doesn't mean you need to use it at this point. So try to keep repeating the same thing. Get the 99%, get the large things right first, get all those good habits into your day and around your cycling first before you think or consider that any of those things might be necessary. And so the road going forward, I love that idea. It's like the most amazing sports analogy. The road ahead and the journey that you will take. It's very important to focus on those big habits. I want you all to start taking more responsibility for your snacks. Now, that is a discussion between your parents and yourself and your coaches, not between, because I can't tell you what you have to take responsibility for yet. But it is really important to start seeing if you can get involved and see what you can do about it. Try as many new things as possible. There is a huge food adventure out there waiting for you. Try not to be limited by being scared of anything. And in terms of practicing, the only way that you will ever figure out what it tastes like is get stuck in the kitchen and start cooking it yourself. Even if sometimes it burns or it doesn't taste so great and you have to secretly put it in the bin when no one is looking.